The room was full of men who looked like they belonged on the cover of a fitness magazine, and then there was Evan Thorpe. He was 41 years old, wore a gray button-down that had seen too many dryer cycles, and he had his 7-year-old daughter Molly standing beside him because the woman next door, who usually watched her, had called in sick that morning, and there was no backup plan, no second option, no time to figure anything else out. Molly held a small stuffed rabbit named Gerald. She'd named it herself at age 4 and refused to rename it even when her kindergarten class laughed. And she looked around the room with the calm, evaluating eyes of a child who had learned early to read a space for danger. Evan had not told her what this place was. He'd said they were going to a meeting. She'd nodded and asked if there would be snacks. There were no snacks. The meeting was a private security recruitment session held on the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, organized by a firm called Harmon's Executive Protection. The job was a 2-year contract providing close protection for a tech executive named Stanton Graves, a man who had recently gone very public about a government contract his company had won, and who had received enough credible threats afterward that his board had insisted on a full-time security detail. The compensation was significant, the kind of significant that would let Evan pay off the last of his wife's medical debt, get Molly into the school she'd been waitlisted for, and maybe stop lying awake at 3 in the morning running numbers in his head. He had found out about the posting through a former colleague and submitted his application 6 weeks ago. He had not expected a callback. He had received one anyway. There were 11 other candidates in the room when Evan arrived. Most of them were between 28 and 35, built with the kind of deliberate gym-cultivated mass that read as authority from across a parking lot. A few had tactical haircuts. Several wore shirts that fit the way shirts fit when someone has specifically purchased shirts to fit that way. They glanced at Evan when he walked in. They glanced at Molly. 2 of them exchanged a look that didn't bother to be subtle. A man near the window, tall, dark-haired, shoulders like a doorframe, watched Evan find a seat along the wall and settle Molly beside him with her rabbit and the small backpack she'd brought with a juice box and her favorite picture book. The man's name was Bryce Cutler. He was 32, former professional mixed martial arts, had done 2 years in private security in Dubai, and he had an easy confidence that came from never once in his adult life walking into a room where he was not immediately recognized as the most physically imposing person present. Evan was not physically imposing. He was 6 feet even, lean in the way that suggested endurance over power, with hands that were rough from outdoor work and a face that had the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself over many years not to react to things immediately. Bryce Cutler looked at him for a moment. Then he said, loud enough to carry, "Wrong floor, maybe? HR is on 6. A few people laughed, not all of them, but enough. Evan looked up. His expression didn't shift. "I'm in the right place," he said, and went back to reading the information packet a receptionist had handed him at the door. Molly, who had heard the comment and understood its intent the way children sometimes understand things with uncomfortable clarity, leaned her head against her father's arm and went back to her book. The assessment was being run by a woman named Constance Fairweather, the firm's senior recruitment director. She was somewhere in her 50s, dressed in charcoal gray, with the manner of someone who had conducted roughly 400 of these sessions and found them neither tedious nor exciting, just necessary. She walked them through the format: a written evaluation, a physical assessment, a scenario walkthrough, and a final panel interview. The day would take approximately 6 hours. Lunch would be provided at the midpoint. She did not comment on Molly's presence. She simply looked at Evan when she reached him during her introductory scan of the room, registered it, and moved on without expression. The written evaluation was first. Standard stuff: situational awareness, decision-making under pressure, knowledge of threat assessment protocols. Evan finished early and spent the remaining 12 minutes watching the room through the window's reflection. Old habit. He caught Bryce Cutler finishing early too, stretching ostentatiously, glancing over at Evan's paper, with an expression that suggested he found the competition amusing. Molly sat in a chair against the wall outside the assessment room, watched over by a junior staff member named Priya, who had taken an immediate, genuine liking to her and brought her a granola bar from the kitchen. Evan could see her through the glass partition. She was fine. She was always fine. She had been required to be fine for a long time, and she had risen to it in ways that sometimes broke his heart quietly. His wife, Joanna, had died 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Molly had been 5. She didn't fully understand what forever meant at 5, but she learned it. Children always learn it. After Joanna died, Evan had quit his position with a Federal Protective Services unit. He'd been there for 11 years. He was good at the work. Very good at it, according to 3 separate performance reviews he had never shown anyone. But it required travel, irregular hours, and the kind of unpredictable absence that was manageable when there were 2 parents and became impossible when there was 1. He had taken contract landscaping work instead. It was physical, predictable, and finished by 3:30 most days, which meant he was at the school gates when the bell rang. He had not told anyone at this assessment about any of that. It wasn't relevant yet. Or maybe it was, he thought. Maybe it was the most relevant thing in the room. The physical assessment happened after lunch. They had cleared the furniture from a large room on the same floor, laid down mats, and set up a series of stations: reaction time, grip strength, a controlled sparring evaluation that Constance Fairweather described as non-competitive contact assessment, designed to observe movement patterns and response calibration, not to determine a winner. Bryce Cutler smiled when she said that. It was the smile of a man who fully intended to determine a winner. They moved through the stations in pairs. Evan was paired first with a quiet man from Winnipeg named George Slade, who went through the assessments methodically and without theater. They exchanged a brief nod afterward that communicated mutual respect in the efficient way that people with similar backgrounds sometimes communicate. The sparring evaluation came last. Bryce had been pairing himself strategically, choosing the largest candidates, moving through them with visible ease in a growing audience. He was genuinely skilled. Evan watched him from across the room and catalogued it. The way he loaded his right side, the slight telegraph before a takedown attempt, the habit of stepping wide when he was certain of dominance. Not carelessness, exactly. Confidence. There was a difference, but under pressure the gap between them narrowed considerably. Constance called the pairs. Evan's name came up alongside Bryce's. There was a sound in the room. Not quite laughter. Something adjacent to it. Bryce rolled his neck and walked to the center of the mat. He looked at Evan with an expression that wasn't hostile. Precisely. It was something more dismissive than hilarity, which was, in its own way, worse. "You sure you want to do this?" he said. "No shame in sitting one out, lots of guys do." Even set down the information packet he'd been holding and walked to the mat. "Name?" the assessor with the clipboard asked. "Even Thorpe, former employer?" He said the name of the federal unit. The assessor wrote it down without reaction. Bryce looked at him again, slightly differently this time, but only slightly. "Freelance after that?" the assessor asked, scanning the form. "Landscaping," Evan said. Someone behind him made a sound. It wasn't a kind sound. "Landscaping," Bryce repeated. "Not a question." He said it the way you'd say a punchline. Evan looked at him steadily. He had heard the sound from the room. He had heard it and filed it away and decided, calmly and without drama, that it was not going to affect what happened next. Constance raised her hand. "Standard contact protocols. When I say stop, you stop. Understood?" Both men nodded. She dropped her hand. Bryce moved first, which Evan had anticipated. He came in fast and direct, a commitment that read as confidence but functioned as information. Evan stepped outside the line of engagement, let Bryce's momentum carry him fractionally past, and applied pressure at a specific point on Bryce's wrist that any joint lock instructor would have recognized immediately, and most people in the room did not. Bryce went down with the controlled abruptness of a man whose body had made a decision that his mind hadn't caught up with yet. It took 4 seconds. The room was quiet. Bryce got up. His expression had changed. "Again," he said. "Cutler," Constance said, a note of mild warning in her voice. "One more. I want to understand what just happened." She looked at Evan. Evan shrugged once. "Fine." This time Bryce was careful. He came in slower, adjusted his footwork, kept his weight distributed. He was adapting, which Evan respected. But adapting to something you don't fully understand is a slower process than it looks. Evan read the adjustment, moved around it, and used a leverage technique he'd learned in a training session in Kandahar 16 years ago that had been taught by a man who had spent 30 years in Israeli defensive tactics. It was not a technique that required size. It required precision, patience, and the willingness to wait 1 full second longer than instinct suggested. Bryce went down again. He stayed there for a moment this time, not hurt, processing. When he stood, something had shifted in his face. The dismissiveness was gone. What replaced it was harder to name, a complicated expression that lived somewhere between reassessment and something uncomfortably close to respect. "What unit did you say?" he asked. Evan told him. Bryce nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "just that." The panel interview was at 4 o'clock. Stanton Graves was present. He was 53, lean, with the watchful eyes of a man who had built a significant company by correctly reading what other people missed, and who had learned in the past 6 months that threat environments were not so different from market environments in the fundamental skill they required: pattern recognition and honest risk assessment. Constance introduced each candidate. When she reached Evan, she noted the federal background, the contact assessment results, and then without comment the fact that he had brought his daughter to the evaluation, and that she had been present in the waiting area all day. Stanton looked at Evan for a moment. "Why'd you bring her?" "My childcare fell through this morning," Evan said. "This was the only assessment date. I wasn't going to not come. Most people would have rescheduled. I've been doing this long enough to know that opportunities like this don't wait. I figured I'd handle the logistics and show up." Stanton leaned back. "What's her name?" "Molly." "How old?" "7. What'd she think of the day?" Evan paused. "She said the granola bar was stale, but the building had a nice view." Something shifted in Stanton's expression. Not quite a smile, something more considered than that. He turned to Constance, and they exchanged a look that Evan couldn't fully interpret, but that felt, for the first time all day, like something moving in his direction. After the panel, candidates waited in a common area while deliberations took place. Most of the men sat separately, scrolling phones, doing the practiced performance of nonchalance. Bryce sat across from Evan. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Bryce said quietly, "The federal unit you named, that's not a desk job." "No," Evan said. "And you left to do landscaping." "I left to pick my daughter up from school." Bryce looked at him. He had a younger brother somewhere. Evan didn't know this, couldn't know it, who had been raised mostly alone after their mother got sick and their father made the predictable kind of exit. Bryce knew in the wordless way that certain experiences leave certain knowledge, exactly what it cost a man to make that kind of choice. He didn't say any of that. He just said, "Fair enough," and went back to his phone. Molly had fallen asleep on the waiting room couch by the time Constance came to find Evan. She walked him to a smaller office where Stanton was waiting. He stood when Evan came in, which was not something he did for everyone, and which he was aware Constance noticed. "We'd like to offer you the contract," Stanton said. "The terms are in the package Constance will give you. We want to start in 3 weeks if that works for you." Evan looked at the package. He did not immediately respond. "I need to know something first," he said. Stanton waited. "The travel component. The brief says up to 40% travel. I need to understand how that's structured, because I have a 7-year-old and her school year runs September through June and I need to be in the city for specific periods. If that's negotiable, we can talk. If it isn't, I need to know now." Stanton looked at him for a moment. "It's negotiable," he said. "I want that in the contract." Stanton glanced at Constance. She gave a small nod, the nod of a woman who had been doing this long enough to recognize when someone was worth the paperwork. "Done," Stanton said. Evan nodded. He looked down at the package. He could feel the weight of 22 months in that moment, the hospital bills and the night shifts and the school drop-offs and the 3 a.m. Sealing and Molly asking once, about 4 months after her mother died, whether he was okay, and him saying yes, fine, don't worry, and meaning it as a reassurance, but feeling, later, the strangeness of being checked on by a 6-year-old who should not have had to carry that question. "Then yes," he said. "I'll take it." When he came back out to the waiting room, Molly was awake again, sitting up with Gerald the rabbit on her lap, watching the elevator doors with the focused patience of a child who had been waiting for a parent to return for long enough that the waiting had become unremarkable. She looked up when he came through the door. "Did you get it?" she asked. He'd told her on the drive over, in the vaguest terms he could manage, that he was trying for a new job. She had received this information solemnly, nodded once, and then asked whether the new job would mean he was still home for dinner. He'd said he would try. Now he crossed the waiting room and crouched down to her level, the way he'd done since she was small enough to need the height equalized. "Yeah," he said. "I got it." Molly looked at him for a moment. Then she held out Gerald. It was not something she did often. Gerald was a private comfort. She didn't share him freely. Evan took the rabbit and held him for a moment and felt the specific texture of that gesture, the weight of what she was offering without having the words for it. "We should get dinner," Molly said. "I'm really hungry. The granola bar wasn't enough." "What do you want?" She thought about it with the gravity of someone making an important decision. "Pho," she said. "From the place on Bloor." He handed Gerald back to her. They walked to the elevator. She took his hand without being asked, which she didn't always do anymore. She was 7, and independence was beginning its long, slow arrival, and he held it the way you hold something that is gradually, inevitably becoming its own. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. Molly watched the floor numbers descend, her rabbit under one arm, her father's hand in the other, perfectly content in the way that children can be content when the specific, irreplaceable adult they need is simply present. Outside, it was a clear September evening in Toronto, the kind that makes the city look like someone lit it carefully. Evan held the door for Molly, and she walked through it without noticing, already talking about Fio, about whether they could get the kind with the beef tendon because she'd decided recently that she liked it, which had surprised him considerably. He followed her out into the evening. For the first time in a long time, the numbers in his head were quiet.